Good to see each of you here. Don't scowl at me. Oh, you're squinting because you can't see. Okay, that's fine. Well, our text this morning is not very Christmassy, so sorry. I did wear a red shirt. Figured maybe that would help, but we're only looking at a fairly short set of verses this morning. It's Acts chapter 12, the last section, 18 to 25. And in this section, Luke covers the death of King Herod. And this is not the King Herod that killed Jesus. This is his grandson, King Herod Agrippa the First. I'm really glad that Luke put this section in here because, to me, it's extremely interesting from a number of different standpoints. I don't know if you'll find it as interesting as me, but if you'll bear with me. Got some handouts coming around. One of the things that makes this passage so interesting is that this account is also given to us, or an account of Herod's death, is also given to us by the Jewish historian Josephus. And I've copied that for you on this green sheet. So I don't expect you to sit and read through the whole thing, but if you're curious, you can. Try to keep one ear open as well. But there are very few events in the New Testament that are also told in an extra biblical account, and this is one of them. This is also interesting because it's one of the, for sure, chronological pegs in the book of Acts. We have a handful of them, and this is one of them. It's a well-known secular figure, the king of Judea, and when he dies, we have a chronological peg there. And that helps us build out the chronology of the rest of the book, actually. We covered a little bit of the history, the setting, last week. Herod Agrippa is the dark brown box, if you will, stair-step on this slide. And the reason it's stair-stepped is because he begins with a small territory, kingdom that he owns, and with each stair step, it grows. He gets more and more territory assigned to him by the Roman emperor. The final section that he gets is Judea, and he reigns over Judea just for about 4 years, 41 to 44, and then he dies a very unpleasant death. You had this map last time that shows you the green is the territory he began to rule over. He was given the pink areas, Perea and Galilee, after that, and finally Judea and Samaria. He is the grandson of Herod the Great through Aristobulus IV. Aristobulus IV was never a ruler. His brothers, Archelaus, Antipas, and Philip, are rulers in this area after the death of Herod the Great. Aristobulus IV never was. But Agrippa I, his son, actually took over as much territory as his father Herod the Great, his grandfather Herod the Great, had ruled over. When Agrippa I dies, the Romans institute some governors again, and then after a while, they grant kingship to his son, Agrippa II. And Agrippa II is the last king of Judea. After him, it just goes into Roman rule. I see that hand. Yeah, Herod, even though we always say it first, it's actually more of a family name. In fact, these other guys, his uncles, you would also know as Herod Philip Herod Antipas and Herod Archelaus. I'm not sure quite what else. Their naming conventions were a little different than ours, but they were typically family related. And you see that even amongst the regular people. Simon Bar Jonah. That one's a little easier for us to understand. Simon, the son of Jonah, or whoever. So, okay, good question. You should also have one of these handouts as well, in addition to your copy of Josephus. So let's jump into this. Well, I guess before we jump, we had the release of Peter from prison at the end of our last lesson. That took place in the spring, and we know that because the text tells us that Herod was waiting for the Passover to be completed before he tried and executed Peter. And of course, Peter was released from jail by an angel. So Acts chapter 12, and we're going to start with verse 18. This is right after Peter had announced his release to the church there in Jerusalem, and then he took off. And Luke doesn't tell us where he went. Verse 18, now when day came, there was no small disturbance among the soldiers as to what had become of Peter. No small disturbance. That's an ironic way of saying there was a really big disturbance. And you can imagine why. We talked last week about there were a group of 16 soldiers assigned to guard him in shifts of 4 each. And, right? Who's responsible here? The text never says that the soldiers fell asleep, but obviously they were completely incapacitated, or woke up or whatever, and they were each chained to Peter. They've still got their chain on. Peter's gone. There were guards at the doors, the gates going out. The doors apparently, well, one of them opened by itself. We don't know if it closed again. They didn't see anybody go out, and here he's gone. So, just from a human perspective, if you didn't know the backstory on this, what would you think had happened? The rapture. These guys are all pre-trib, these Roman soldiers. A selective rapture. Well, I mean, it would have to be an inside job, right? I mean, there's no group that comes in and batters down the doors, or, I mean, how else could it happen? Somebody slipped him a key. But even then, you would think, they're going to be awake. They're going to know he's rattling with his chains and sneaking out. And, oh, but there's the guy at the door. Shucks, put him back in. I mean, what are the chances? Even, well, yeah. So what happens to them? Verse 19. When Herod had searched for him, I'll pause there just for a second, and had not found him. So Herod did take some time and say, okay, he's around here somewhere. Let's find him. And he was unsuccessful, which also tells me Peter didn't stick around. Peter talked to the church, and then he hoofed it out of there. Herod searched for him, had not found him. He examined the guards and ordered that they be led away. And that's a euphemism for execution. Don't know how many. If he was fair about it and said, okay, just the 4 that were in charge at that moment, or if he said, nope, you're a group, you're all going down together, I don't know. The text doesn't tell us. I stuck this picture in to illustrate this no small disturbance. You see the guy on the ground kind of pointing at the guy on the horse, like, did you do it? It was your fault, right? The guy on the horse is like, no, man, not me. I was minding my own business and didn't do anything. So the captors became the captives. And I think you could probably even say the executioners became the executed in this case. It's hard to say. I mean, certainly not all 16. It could have been some of them. They may have had an official executioner. I don't know. It was not, I guess I'm thinking back to John the Baptist. They beheaded him in jail. Did they send in a special guy, or was it just, okay guys, jailers, you know what to do? I don't know. Could be either one, but it's a fun picture. I mean, you feel bad for the guys, but a chain around their neck and wearing nothing but a diaper. Humiliating. Okay. And then the end of verse 19, and he, that's Herod Agrippa the first, went down from Judea to Caesarea and was spending time there. Most of the governors, Roman governors of Judea, made Caesarea their principal residence. Herod Agrippa was kind of unique because he preferred to reside in Jerusalem. He wanted to please the Jews. That was a big thing on his to-do list, and he apparently did it pretty effectively. It was actually why he had wanted to kill Peter and why he did kill James. So what's he doing going down to Caesarea? Luke doesn't tell us. Josephus does. Josephus says he was going down because there was a big celebration in honor of Caesar. And of course, he's going to preside. They would have had lots of food. They would have had games, chariot races, foot races, parades, that kind of stuff down at Caesarea, which was ideally situated for that. And of course, you're not going to do that up at Jerusalem, which is a Jewish enclave where the temple is. You're not going to celebrate Caesar there. So he went down to Caesarea to do that. So I'm going to show you a couple of photos of Caesarea. This rocky thing sticking out into the sea, known as the Promontory Palace, that's where his residence was. That's where his palace was, where he would have lived when he went down to Caesarea. Not a whole lot left today, but I'll show you a couple other pictures there too. You can see the theater, which has been rebuilt in modern times. It hasn't survived in that good a shape from antiquity, but a very impressive theater facing the sea. And off to the left is the Hippodrome, and that's a place where they would have, it's a much larger area. The seating is not so high, and they would have done things like horse races and chariot races there, and also foot races, that kind of thing, which you can't do in a theater. Little different perspective here from almost above the theater. You can see the upper and lower palaces. By the way, the upper palace, this is something to tuck away for later. Paul will go on 3 different missionary journeys, come back to Jerusalem, be arrested, have his life threatened, be taken down at night to Caesarea for safekeeping. And that upper palace is almost certainly where he would have been jailed during that time. He spent 2 years there. You remember the names Festus and Felix and some of those guys. That's when Paul was down here at Caesarea in jail for a couple of years. So there would have been facilities for that kind of thing there. Here's an artist's rendition of the city. Turn it on, Kris. A large port that was built by Herod the Great. The palace is over here. You can see the theater, the Hippodrome. Sorry, not that one. It's this one. Uh-oh. It's this one. Third time's the charm. Is the major temple there dedicated both to Caesar and to the goddess Roma, who symbolized Rome. So you can see the closeness of the palace, hippodrome, theater, and the temple that were there. And ancient sources tell us that that temple was beautiful and quite large. There's almost nothing left there today. Foundation stones. It's not much to look at when you go there. But we do know where it was, what size it was, that kind of stuff. Just another photo. By the way, we're going to come back to right here. There's a royal pavilion, if you will, where Herod will give his speech. So this is the promontory palace sticking out into the sea, and in the middle of it you can see a pool, which was apparently filled with seawater for swimming, had a colonnade around it. I have a picture of that, don't I? Yes, an artist's drawing. So just a beautiful, luxurious palace, unique in a lot of different ways. Beautiful place to live. Some breeze off the sea, which would be really nice during the summer especially. Built by Herod the Great and now inhabited by his grandson. A ground level view of that area. Not a whole lot left today, but enough that you can piece together what it looked like. So Luke tells us in verse 20, now he was very angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon, and with one accord they came to him, and having won over Blastus, the king's chamberlain, they were asking for peace, because their country was fed by the king's country. Whew, a lot of fun stuff in there. Tyre and Sidon, located up the coast. Get the pointer out again. So here's Caesarea, here's Jerusalem, and Tyre is up here, Sidon is up here. Tyre and Sidon, I'm sure you're familiar with those names. They made their money off of trade, sea trade, land trade. Their one resource was timber, the cedars of Lebanon. They had massive forests and could export timber. They didn't have large areas where they could farm. So if you're going to have a large city, how do you feed it? And so they traded for food, and apparently Herod had some control over that from the south. They may have even shipped a lot of their food from his region. If you go back and look at it, do you remember Solomon got timber to build the temple from Tyre, the king of Tyre, Hiram? And in exchange, he sent Hiram food. Now, he also gave him some minor territories up in the north, but he sent him grain, wine, and oil, if you go look in Kings. So this is not a new setup. And Luke tells us here that they depended on him for their food. I was just talking with Rick about the character on the back of the bulletin this morning, and he seemed to think that was a little more difficult than some have been. Next week will be easy. But I thought about putting Blastus on there. He occurs this one time, and then I thought, no, that's a little too difficult. It was actually a fairly common name in antiquity. This is an early 2nd century inscription, and you can see the name appears twice, Claudio Blasto and Claudius Blastus. It's actually a father-son that have the same name. The son is dedicating the inscription. It's a funerary inscription to his father. They both share the same name, Claudius Blastus. So this guy's name was Blastus as well. That's an interesting, my New American Standard has the word chamberlain. Literally in the Greek, it's the one who's over the bedroom. It's like he had a dude that was in charge of his bedroom? Well, it's probably similar to minister. That's a common political designation in the UK and sometimes in the US, Minister of Finance or whatever. They're not a minister like a preacher. And this Chamberlain is not the guy that's folding the bed sheets and shaking the potpourri every couple days. He's a close personal advisor. I can't explain for you exactly why they use this phrase, but apparently it's a term that everybody understood in that day for somebody that was close to him and also was an advisor. It isn't just, you know what your maid says you should do. It wasn't that kind of thing. This is a guy that Herod actually consults. This is a bedroom from about that time up at Masada. It's empty now. It's got a nice mosaic floor, frescoed walls. This is a reconstruction that shows you what it may have actually looked like. We don't usually paint our walls black, at least our bedroom walls, but that was one of the styles that they had at this time. This is a reconstruction out of Italy. And again, the bed is missing in this display. You can see a table, a stone table, and then a candelabrum, candlestick, about 4 feet tall in the back there. And they would have put a lamp on top of that. You might remember Jesus talks about you put a lamp on a lampstand, not under a bushel. Well, this is an example of the kind of lampstand he would have been talking about. Okay. We don't know, neither Luke nor Josephus tells us what the dispute was about, why they were at odds with each other. Apparently, Herod, he must have had an embargo on those two cities. They're port cities, and with ships, he could have prevented them from getting shipments of food. And apparently, it was a legal thing for him to do. Verse 21, on an appointed day, Herod, having put on his royal apparel, took his seat on the rostrum and began delivering an address to them. So first of all, he wants to make a show, and so he puts on his royal robes. The clothes make the man, right? It's like, why are you wearing red this morning, Kris? I don't know. Maybe the clothes don't always make the man, but this is a statue of Augustus that has been painted to reflect what it would have looked like originally. Most of the statues, Greco-Roman statues you see, are just stone. They don't have any of the paint on them anymore. But they find little microscopic bits of it when they look and can figure out what colors they are. So here we've got some red and some blue. Not unusual for them to wear purple. What's even more fascinating here is that Josephus gives us a further description of his apparel. And he says that his garment was made wholly of silver. This is fascinating. He goes on to say the silver of his garment was illuminated by the fresh reflection of the sun's rays upon it. Josephus tells us this event took place early in the morning. And it shone out brilliantly and was so resplendent as to inspire awe in those who looked intently upon him. So, today it's pretty easy to get metallic-like clothing, or clothing that looks metallic, has little threads of synthetic something that is reflective. Back in that day, the only way to do that was to actually use metal thread. I wish I knew how they made the thread. You probably don't care, but that intrigues me. It's got to be pretty fine to weave, but they did. In fact, we have evidence as much as 600 or 700 years earlier than the time of Herod that the Romans were using what we would call cloth of gold or cloth of silver. Another name for it is lame. It's cloth that is weaved with metal thread. Sometimes they would wrap the metal thread around a piece of linen or something else to give it a certain amount of strength. As early as the 7th century BC, we have found archaeological evidence of this. So it's in no way out of the realm of possibility that he actually had a cloak of silver. The pieces that we have that remain from that early are very fragmentary. Little bits of thread, metal thread embedded within other fibers that were once a cloak. This is much more recent, the 1800s. It's the same kind of thing, and one of the things I like about this is that it's not a modern, like, tinsel or whatever. This is actually silver woven in with another, I don't know if it's linen, it could be something like silk. They did both. Historical sources talk more about the use of gold cloth, or cloth of gold, than they do cloth of silver. And it was a kingly material. Even so, when you think of kingly cloth in antiquity, you probably think first and foremost of purple, because that was a difficult color to make. They'd squeeze these little glands on these sea snails and get a tiny drop out. Pick up the next one, work their way down, squeeze that tiny drop out. You get enough of that, you can dye a material and make it purple. But because it was expensive and everybody wanted it, they found other ways to do it. In fact, around the time of the 1st century, there were probably dozens of different ways to make purple. And it became common enough that almost every kid of some class would wear a white toga with a purple stripe. It was just kind of the thing that they did. People would even use purple or purple thread stuff, not the entire garment being purple, but as a couch cover. Now, these are well-to-do people, of course, but it tells you purple is not just for royalty. Lame was just for royalty. You're actually using, you can't, well, they couldn't fake that. It was actually gold. They talk about other materials like silk or combinations of materials that were extraordinarily expensive, that were actually worth their weight in gold. This stuff was gold or silver. So what is Herod saying when he puts on a mantle of silver? He's not quite saying, I'm the emperor, but he's coming pretty close. He's making a statement with his threads. I have wondered that same thing. I think wrapping the silver thread or gold thread around another kind of material helped. One of my first thoughts was, well, what about electricity? Here comes the lightning. No, it would have been ironic if he had gone by lightning strike. Tarnish, silver tarnishes. But I mean, look at this piece of material from the 19th century. It's probably not quite as beautiful as it was the day it came off the press, but it's not like turned completely black or something either. So I don't know. I would assume in the modern day it's been treated, but it's survived all this time. So yeah, more questions that I wish I had a good answer to. I can only imagine it would have had some weight to it and would have felt like I've got some real clothes on here. Something expensive.
I was wondering, if you put steel wool near your skin,
Mm-hmm.
splinters from it,
Hmm.
that would have been
Little pokey stuff. Uh-huh. It wouldn't surprise me if, well, I would expect he would have had an undergarment on that would have helped that. But yeah, I mean, there's got to be parts that, yeah. Yeah, yeah. Reflect the sun. Uh-huh. This is a complete gown made of lame, a lame gown from the film Cleopatra in the 30s. Just went on auction a while back. But I thought, oh, it's a nice illustration of what that kind of metallic material. And I believe that this was before they got into the whole tinsel thing. I think this is legit as far as actually being metallic thread. And I know this one is. These are just little swatches. One's from Queen Victoria's dress at her coronation, and I've seen paintings of that. It's before photography. Pretty amazing stuff. Really, she was dazzling. And then the big chunk is off the altar cloth. But again, this is legitimate gold that's been woven into material. So Herod's doing something like this. Just a dazzling sight. And Josephus makes a big deal out of that. Luke kind of passes by. It just says his royal apparel. But they also, well, before I get to that, he takes a seat on his, well, this is a throne and a footstool, fairly common for rulers of this time. The place where he would have sat was in the hippodrome, not exactly where the arrow's pointing, but right over here. There's a later building that they've left unexcavated that sticks out into the hippodrome here. But he had there's a royal pavilion, and this doesn't show it. This is looking right at the very end, and the palace is in the background. Here you can see the pavilion where Herod would have stood to make his speech. Again, Josephus says this is early in the morning. The sun's just come up, and there's not much of a rise behind him. So he would have been visible, the sun glistening off of his royal apparel pretty early in the morning. I'm not convinced that this giant wall was in the back either, but it shows you chariot race at a hippodrome. So again, there's a much later building that's been left unexcavated here. So that's just later junk that they wanted to leave. But his rostrum or dignitary's platform was back here, where he sat down to speak. There you can see it across the way and a little bit closer up. And of course, Luke just dives right in and says, the people kept crying out, the voice of a God and not of a man. Josephus gives a little more detail in telling about this gorgeous silver gown or clothing or whatever that he's got on, the sun shining off of it, and that seems to be a little more of a reason why these people feel they can say that. And what's Herod's response? Again, Luke just says, immediately an angel of the Lord struck him in verse 23, because he did not give God the glory, and he was eaten by worms and died. It was actually not uncommon for Roman emperors to accept praise as deities. We have a ton of descriptions that mention the divine Caesar so-and-so. They often did that. In fact, Caesar was worshipped in the temple just down the street here as divinity. So does that affect Herod? And he thinks, I can be a god too. They're saying it, not me. Josephus, though, tells us that It's on the first side of the page there. He states it a little differently. Be merciful to us, for although up to now we've reverenced you only as a man, from now on we'll recognize you as superior to mortal nature. In other words, you're not mortal, you're a god. And hearing this, the king did not rebuke them nor reject their impious flattery. So, and then Josephus goes on to talk about the owl thing. He'd had a vision, according to Josephus earlier, about an owl being an omen of an ill wind. Luke is a little more straightforward. Immediately an angel of the Lord struck him because he did not give glory to God, and he was eaten by worms and died. Not a pleasant end. We don't know, I can't give you any idea what sort of medical condition this might have been. Those are always intriguing questions. Probably not just hookworms. Most people survive that kind of stuff, or a tapeworm. And Josephus doesn't help us there. Josephus tells us he was immediately struck by an agony in his stomach, and that then they carted him off, and he seems to have known, these are my last hours. Josephus tells us that he survived about 5 days before he succumbed. I don't think that contradicts what Luke says. I think those accounts easily go together. Luke doesn't say that very day he died. He just said God struck him and he died. This is interesting. One of my commentators states that the reason Luke tells this story right here is to connect it to his persecution of Peter. This is not just a random, Herod died young. He was pretty young. He could have, you would expect him to have reigned much longer than he did, but he died an unnatural death here that both Luke and Josephus attribute to judgment by God. And I think Luke is hinting at the fact this is because he's persecuting the church. Just fascinating stuff. We look at these things and think it's impossible. The guy's the boyhood friend of the Roman Emperor Caligula. He's now reigning over this vast region of Judea. He's good buddies with the religious authorities in Jerusalem. He's watching himself on all the, purity laws and all this kind of stuff. And now he's against us, the church, God's true people. What chance do we have? We're okay. God's on our side. And God says, Herod, you're done. Herod's done. And does not get replaced by another king, at least not for a few years. Yeah, no, it's broken. It's part of a larger set. Polyphemus. I think it's the guys, I'm going to get mixed up here. It comes out of Greek legend where guys go to fight this giant and a bunch of them die. And so it was actually part of a larger set. But yeah, it's pretty badly broken, so. You like that one better? They apparently, I'm assuming Herod had more clothes on than this, but they apparently had to cart him off. He wasn't able to walk back to the palace and passed away fairly quickly. Verse 24, but the word of the Lord continued to grow and to be multiplied. And I don't think it's any accident that that statement stands right after Herod being struck with worms and dying. There's a contrast here. Herod, the seemingly healthy, invincible guy, he's gone. The word of the Lord, which he was so opposed to, it keeps growing. That is significant. Verse 25. And Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem when they had fulfilled their mission, taking along with them John, who was also called Mark. We have a little bit of a strange verbiage here. Your translation might say he returned to Jerusalem. There's only a couple of versions, English versions, that do that, but it's, I won't go into that. I don't have time. From the context, and there's a number of different ways this can be worded in English, it appears, you remember that they had come down to Jerusalem to deliver some moolah to the church there because of a famine relief visit. And so apparently they had concluded that now and were headed back to their home in Antioch. Just to hopefully help you, Luke has jumped around a little bit time-wise. The end of chapter 11, he talked about this visit of Barnabas and Saul down to Jerusalem, and that took place in about 46. We can calculate that from a number of different angles. But then he jumps back to talk about the martyrdom of James and the death of Herod Agrippa. So he pauses, goes back a couple years to talk about that and the release of Peter. And now at the very end of chapter 12, he will jump back forward to the return from Jerusalem to Antioch of Saul or Paul and Barnabas. So we're not going to meet the next couple of weeks for Sunday school. We'll have Christmas next week and New Year's. It's a good place because this chapter marks the end, a significant break right here. The first two sections, Peter was the main figure. We were introduced to Paul, but Peter was the main figure. Starting with chapter 13, which is our next place, Paul is the main figure that Luke follows. It's not that Peter dies or is no longer relevant, but Luke is following the route of the gospel as it spreads toward Rome. And we have a major change here. In fact, I said this last week, but we will not hear of Peter again in the book of Acts, with one exception. He'll be named. So, just one application here before we close. Popular and powerful people, and I didn't mean to have that many P's, are not immune to the judgment of God, whether here or sometimes it's in the age to come. For sure in the age to come if it's not here. But I just think that's a major takeaway of this section. God sees, he pays attention, and when he wants to, rulers are plucked out. All of that to say, don't get your undies in a bundle over what's going on in our political scene. It's not out of control. You may not like what you see, but keep the main thing the main thing. Keep growing the gospel, keep growing in your faith, keep doing what is right, what pleases God, laying up treasure in heaven. The political stuff will come and go, and God can take care of that. So let him. I'm not saying don't vote. Don't be involved in any way, but don't make that your main focus. God takes care of that. Do what you're supposed to be doing with your life, living how you're supposed to, doing things that please him, and he will bless that. I've gone over. Thanks for your patience. Let me close with a word of prayer. Lord, thank you so much for your word. fun to read the ways in which you pushed the gospel out of Jerusalem, across the land of Judea and Samaria, up into the north, and eventually we know around the globe. We're excited to be a part of that, to be sons and daughters of yours, and help us to live in a way that reflects our relationship with you well. Help us to live righteously and to be quick to spread your word to others and to do things that please you. And we rely on you for the strength to do that. In your name I pray.